Hello, hello. Happy Monday. I was a little bit back and forth on topics, but we may have found one. Just thinking about like peace and quiet, and not necessarily in the colloquial way that we use it, where people say, "Oh, I need some peace and quiet." Yes, that's kind of on topic, but not exactly what I was sitting with. So sitting with the idea of peace and and just peace, but it didn't feel quite like the full idea that I wanted to go with, and quiet being another aspect to that, and isolation and solitude. So one of the things that I reflect on personally a lot, and then will bring up in my clinical work with people, is if they know how to define the difference between isolation and solitude, and why there can be maybe a difficult understanding of that balance and which is which. So, solitude is taking time to reconnect and recharge. For a lot of people, that is taking time to be with God or to reconnect spiritually as well. I always like to use the example of Superman in the Fortress of Solitude, if you've read or seen those. It's this place that he goes to be away from the world, but not quite alone. And I think that's an important part of solitude. Solitude is not being alone. It is being present with oneself, present with God, present in a way that is not complete separation from the world. It's just separation from almost all of it, but not quite. There's also why a lot of people have trouble being by themselves, is because they struggle to have a relationship with themselves in a lot of ways. And so solitude forces them to confront their own self, which is why they will fill time with screens, even books, just things where they don't have to be in their own mind. And that is not solitude. That's not solitude. That is more distraction or isolation or time away from things just for the sake of it. And there's a good argument for a lot of people that they still feel a little recharged after it, but usually not as much as solitude would be my argument there. And that depends on your ability to be in solitude as well. So, for example, if you're not used to being alone and you take time for solitude, it can actually be really stressful because you got your thoughts racing in, you haven't learned how to control your thoughts, your emotions. This is why meditation can be really hard for some people, or even asking them to sit 60 seconds and focus on one thing is stressful. It's usually a very good sign that it needs to be practiced. And we can go through ups and downs. I think everyone has the ability to practice that and to improve at it. And we all have the ability to backslide and get worse at it if we don't practice it, not necessarily every day, but as a way of being, of just focusing on what's happening in front of us. So, this video would be a lot harder for me if I was distracted by everything else. And the world around me can make that easier. So right now, it's pretty quiet. Very light ambient noise. But if there was noise happening around me in different rooms here or outside, or if there's something distracting, even a storm, that could make it harder for me to focus. Now, that doesn't mean I have permission to lose focus. It just means it makes it harder. And that would be a higher difficulty level of being meditative or being still and quiet. So, solitude is that. Isolation is just separation. That's why they do that in certain prisons. You go into solitary confinement. You're isolated from the rest of the population there. We do that with the prison system in general. We isolate you from other people. And that might be good to keep people away who are being problematic or causing problems, but it's not necessarily the long-term solution to the issue. It's relationally depriving, and we know from research that that's unhealthy. You can still have good relationships in prison, but complete separation relationally is not good. This is also why a lot of families have thrived on a discipline style that is a relational discipline. So a lot of kids will be sent to a corner or their room and stuff like that. And I would argue often a better form of discipline. Now, the parents have to be mature to do this, which is not always the case, is to create the discipline as a relational activity. So, for instance, if you're a dad and your child disrespects their mother, and that's going to be a form of discipline action having to be taken, instead of sending them away or hurting them in any way, the discipline is that they have to help mom. They have to relationally mend the damage. So that might be whatever tasks mom is doing that day. The kid helps to some extent. Now, depending on the issue, that might mean that the other parent has to step in and make sure that it's not creating more disrespect. This is why it's hard for some people. They try to start it and they quit early because they're like, I can't deal with them right now. And it's often because we've created a household where the response is, I can't deal with you, get away. And to change the household to say, that's not appropriate, we're going to spend more time together, that's actually hard for the parents. And it's usually the parents that quit on that, not the kids. Because most kids want, I would argue all kids want connection with their parents. And that takes a lot of work when you have a disconnected home to start reintegrating connection. And usually there's going to be pushback at certain ages, especially if you're doing connection as a form of discipline. So it is useful. Relationships are useful, and isolating is not typically very useful for the most part long term. But it takes mature discipliners to do that properly, and that includes our government with how we discipline. And it takes a mature, again, discipliner, mature government, mature leader or authority to do those things properly. And that's very hard to do if you yourself are not there. Potentially impossible if you haven't reached the point where you can focus in, relationally connect with people, and see the benefit of relationship. But again, that's pretty unanimously understood in research that relationships are important. This is why isolation is not usually a good method. And this is where people will fail in their grief a lot, is they'll isolate and disconnect. And that is going to hurt them more. And that's not really a debatable thing. That's harmful to isolate. Now, maybe you don't have people that you can go to, and that's a different issue. It doesn't mean your isolation is good. Probably shows that you have not had the best position for relationships, whether that's by choice or circumstance. And so that needs amended. So that doesn't necessarily mean if you're grieving in isolation that you're doing something wrong, but the circumstance isn't good. Because you do need people to grieve with. And so if you're going through something, solitude time is fine. If you need to cry, if you need to reflect, if you need to pray, if you need to sleep, if you need to just be away from crowds, that's fine. You just don't want to isolate and remove relationships. So I know these are kind of long and elaborated definitions, but I do think it's very important to understand the difference between these and why time away can feel bad sometimes, especially people who really like their friends and family, and they feel like they have to take time away, and you don't always have to. It's recharge is what it is. So this is where you get extroversion and introversion coming in a little bit, and which are typically words that I won't use, especially in a clinical setting. It's more a question of relational fill. I'll use like a gas tank metaphor on that, is just how full your relational tank is. So some people need a lot more relational time, some people need less. What it is knowing, have you had your fill of people that are healthy? So I get my fill of unhealthy people very fast. I don't want to be around them. I don't, unless it's in some way trying to be helpful and they've agreed to it. But people who are just causing problems and creating chaos or being foolish and not helping at least my world in any way, they don't benefit me for me to be around them. And that's a tank that fills very quickly. I am ready to be done very quick. With people who are good for me, they're encouraging, they're supportive, they're loving, that's a different thing. So if you're comparing how fast you, well, I should say this, if you're not using a comparison between types of people, that's going to be probably an issue. So I've heard people tell me, I just get very tired very quickly with this group of people or these people, my work people. I don't have the energy for it. And that'll usually be an early question for me is, what kind of people are they? Do they mix with you? Do they blend with you? Do they have the same values? And do they care about you? Do they love you? Do they encourage you? If you're getting no on all those answers, then of course they're going to drain you quickly. And the issue is then if you take that standard and say, I am introverted and I don't like to spend time around people, that's not a good conclusion. That you can only really assess that with people that you have healthy relationships with. If they're unhealthy, especially if they're not encouraging and supportive in good relationships, you're going to have a very skewed understanding of relationships and what you need in relationships. Now, you'll feel the need. You might not have words for it, but you will feel the lack of healthy relationship. Your body knows, your mind knows, every part of you knows that you're not getting it. You might not be able to put words to it, and that's where we go seek things out in other ways, where we'll seek out vices. This is where a lot of addiction will come from. I take a very strong stance on addiction being very attachment-based. I don't know that I would say it's entirely that, but it's often filling a void for a lot of people. And it's well worth everyone's time to look into the heroin use in Vietnam and what we know about heroin addiction and how many people using it over there came back and they weren't addicted anymore. And that's a really big foundation for a lot of the attachment understanding. So look that up because that's very interesting. So when you're a young kid and all the people who love you are really far away and you might die at any given moment, you feel very empty and you might use things like heroin or prostitutes or other things that are vices and addictive. And when you get back home to all the loving people and you're not concerned about being killed every day, you might not need those things anymore. So totally look into that. It's fascinating. So when we miss out on the love and care and encouragement that we need, we try to find it elsewhere. And sometimes we take the best option we can find, or sometimes we find something that it fills the hole partially, but it's the wrong item. That's a lot of addiction. And that sucks, especially if that's what you've been modeled your whole life. So don't judge your relational capacity by bad relationships. That's not a good metric for your actual relational capacity, which then means it's not a good metric for helping you understand what is actually solitude for you and what is isolation. And oftentimes, if you have these bad relationships, your isolation that you choose, that you're thinking might be solitude, is actually just separation from people that stress you out. Whereas, to me, genuine solitude is actually removing myself from people that I love for a short bit of time to connect. And for some people, that's getaway weekends from time to time, and other people, it's just a walk every day or a couple minutes meditating on their own. It doesn't have to be dramatic things like that. It doesn't have to be dramatic things. It can be very simple things. So, if you're defining solitude as time away from stressful people, that's probably just you trying to get away from stressful people. It's not necessarily solitude. So at that point, you probably are just isolating from people that are stressful, and you're getting away from them because they're not being very helpful to you and what you need, and probably not, oftentimes not helpful to themselves either, because you can have dramatically different beliefs and worldviews and still be very caring and encouraging and loving of people. So there's just a certain element sometimes where when we have different beliefs, it can make it hard to connect empathetically over certain issues, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those people aren't going to be very helpful to you. And that's something that gets missed a lot with love. People define love way too surface a lot of the time. And people take disagreements and political differences as a lack of love and care. And that's also often coming from a very, very skewed perspective of what love actually is. I think our society is very bad at understanding love. I also think we have a lot to learn about how to show love too, and it's a rough go for a lot of people because of that stuff. So yeah, so I would encourage everyone to just think about how you're defining solitude and isolation. Like, think a lot about that and see if you are doing it well. Not perfect, but well. Are you taking that time and reconnecting? If you're a religious person, are you taking time to connect religiously, or are you just kind of passively religious? Because that's going to cause you problems too. If you're a spiritual person, a philosophical person, are you just taking time to connect with those things loosely? Because if you are, that's going to be a problem for you. It's something that you need to dive in fully. And if you're a type of person that believes in certain values and you just apply them loosely, again, you're going to make problems for yourself. So everyone operates under some system of belief. And if you don't know what that is, then you're kind of a loose cannon for people. This is why you'll hear people say that they've had good relationships for years and then the person just kind of flipped a switch. I think a lot of the time it's because they're not actually grounded in anything. They just have a philosophy that works when things are easy. And a lot of society is easy nowadays compared to what it used to be by a landslide. And people root themselves in very light things. People say, I just think you just be kind to people and be nice and, treat people with respect. And that's that. That's fantastic. What are you rooting that in? And if you think kindness is a value, you have to really think about what that looks like in action, being kind and receiving kindness, where that might run into an issue. So is kindness something that can ever be a choice for you? Or is it something that you do no matter what? Honesty is another one. People all the time will say, I value honesty. And they have to really decide, are there situations where you would lie? And I think those situations, for me, are how I make friendship judgments a lot of the time. So if someone is lying, the common example of lying to save a life, sure, that's one thing. Or lying because it's convenient for you. So to me, that means you don't really value honesty. You value yourself over the value. So to me, that's not a very smart friend, because that means anytime that we have something that bumps heads, they will protect themselves versus the relationship, and they'll lie to make it easier. And that's a formula for a bad long-term relationship. So that's why rooting yourself, that's what that solitude time is also meant to do. It's to connect with that. Like, how am I acting out these values and beliefs? How am I interacting with the world around me? What should I be convicted on right now? What should I feel encouraged about? And a lot of people just don't do that. And it's so helpful. And this is also why, from everything I've seen, you can have really good relationships with people who believe wildly different things. Because if you are someone who roots yourself in your values and you interact with someone else who roots themselves in their values, you can both be clear about those values. And a lot of the times they will intersect positively. And there might be areas where they won't. But when people are honest with their values and they are actually acting them out, they become healthily predictable. They become very unpredictable to people who aren't operating their value systems. Because in their mind, they're like, well, why wouldn't they lie? I don't understand why they told the truth, or I don't understand why they do that. It's because they're actually consistent. And there's an irony in that being inconsistent makes you kind of predictable in certain ways, because you can predict where that person is going to act in the interest of self versus the value and the belief, a bigger thing than themselves. So two people that are really acting in their values as an action thing, not just in words, are going to be able to interact usually pretty well, because they can understand each other and know, actually, that person does have my best interest in mind. They just believe this. Great. Or they can say, I know that person doesn't have my best interest in mind because they are true to their values and their values are harmful to me, and they've said that, and we're not going to get along. And the other person would agree to that too. And I think that's an important part too. We see this with a lot of political discourse where someone says, your values are harmful to me. And that person says, I don't think they are. So there's a misunderstanding there. Now that could be a lot of different things, and there often is a lot of different reasons why that's a misunderstanding, but there is a misunderstanding happening. So if you believe that harm should come to someone and that's a value, then you would agree to that. We've seen this a lot with like Nazism and communism and stuff like that. The belief system is harm should come to those people. And this is, racist and sexist stuff of, I think those people are bad. Like they would agree with you on that value. People who say I don't agree with that, then we have a misunderstanding, and that's room for conversation. If someone tells me, hey, you don't love me because you believe this. Part of my actions that I believe in is to love people. So if someone says that about me, I would argue they're not calling me out. They're saying something wrong. There's a misunderstanding. But they might be calling out some part of my actions that are incongruent with my belief. And then we can talk about that because I want to address that, because they're wrong about my belief, but they might be right about the action that happened. Maybe I was being unloving. So yeah, we should talk about that so I can correct that. But they would be wrong if they said I don't love certain people, because that isn't true. My values are to love everyone. So hopefully that makes sense how that's all being shown. And anyway, all this comes back to solitude versus isolation. So I'll encourage anyone listening, practice solitude. It doesn't have to be a long time. Long stints, I think, can be very helpful. But starting with simple things of just taking time to yourself, seeing, are you comfortable in a relationship with yourself? Are you actually practicing your beliefs? Or do you just say them because they sound nice and you actually don't know how they would be tested? These are really, really helpful things. So I encourage everyone for that this week. If you're listening on Monday, you have the whole week for it. If you listen at any time, go for it. I think it's helpful. If you're interested in any type of therapy services, reach out to me. Info is in the description. I can help and be available as best I can. Therapy services in Missouri and Kansas, and options to get people connected in other states or with different therapists if I'm not a good fit. I love doing that because I know it can be hard to find a provider. So anyone who wants to seek out services or just chat a bit, feel free to reach out to me. And other than that, I hope you all can find some solitude this week and also find some joy in that solitude. So until next time, see you later.